we're going to get back to the discussion about Baltimore and race and everything that's going on in the United States. I think it's a subset of a whole lot of stuff that has to do with the history of this country. And one of the more important parts of the history of this country is Vietnam. And this weekend here in Washington, D.C., is an extraordinary conference going on. And it's lessonsofvietnam.com is the website, lessonsofvietnam.com. And if you have any interest in showing, it's Friday and Saturday this weekend, and I will be moderating a panel on Saturday with Alan Canfora and Mark Rudd and David Harris and Susan Schnall about the lessons of Vietnam. It's called The Personal Impact of Our Actions and Reflections. And Alan Canfora is on the line with us. Alan, welcome.
Thank you.
Am I saying your last name right?
Yes, Canfora.
Great, cool. You are an activist. You were an organizer and survivor of the Kent State Massacre 45 years ago this year. In fact, 45 years ago next week. Your website, Alan Canfora, AlanCanFora.com, and May4.org, and, of course, lessonsofvietnam.com. Alan, tell us your story.
Well, when I first went to Kent State in 1968, I was not really an activist, but soon thereafter I joined the Students for a Democratic Society and became quite active on the campus at Kent State. I was just a foot soldier in the anti-war army. I was not a leader or anything, but I was inspired enough to continue into the 1969-70 school year, which of course culminated with Nixon's invasion of Cambodia on April 30th, 1970. And then some of us at Kent protested vigorously during May 1st through 4th, even to the point where the National Guard was called in, and finally they ended up shooting into a crowd of unarmed students. 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded, including me. I was shot through my right wrist.
Ouch. How's your wrist now?
Oh, my wrist has fully recovered, but some of the other people that were injured still suffer the pains of their injuries. One guy is in a wheelchair, Dean Kaler, for the rest of his life.
Oh, my. Oh, my. So in your mind, Alan Canfora, what is the lesson of Vietnam for us today?
Well, I think the lesson is that sometimes our leadership in Washington and the generals in the Pentagon can overreach. They can make mistakes. They can exercise poor judgments. Then who ends up paying the consequences? It's the soldiers. It's the young people of our country. And during Vietnam, it was people that I knew, that I was growing up with, went to school. These are my neighbors, my friends, my relatives. They were shipped off to Vietnam, and I think we learned a very bitter lesson that sometimes the U.S. government and the military, these people are capable of making a very terrible mistake, and then it becomes up to the people to try to stop that war.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on, I got into this conversation of the weekend with a couple of the other people who are going to be on the panel, and one of them was just outspokenly opposed to there ever being a draft. I had always assumed that much of the anti-Vietnam War activity wouldn't have been going on if people weren't being drafted out of their families and then their families got outraged, especially when they came back dead or wounded, and that a draft introduced into the military people who were skeptical of the military, whereas an all-volunteer military doesn't do that. What are your thoughts on the draft?
Well, I'm against the draft. I think it's very unfair to take regular citizens who are healthy and take them away from their families and their jobs, like during the war in Vietnam. For example, back in those days when they did have the U.S. military draft, anybody that had a lot of money, they could talk to a doctor, they could get an excuse to avoid the draft. Consequently, you didn't see very many rich kids dying or fighting in Vietnam. It was mostly working class and poor people.
Right.
So I think the draft is inherently unfair just because of the fact that it does affect the poor and working class in a much more disproportionate manner.
What if we were to adopt a system like, for example, I don't know if Germany still has this, but when I lived there back in the 80s, after you graduate from high school, you do a year of public service. You can choose to go into the military, or you can choose to volunteer in a hospital or any other nonprofit organization for a year. You have to travel out of your home city. You get to see the country anyway, if not the world. And at the end of that year, in exchange for that, you get a free college education or trade school or whatever you'd like. It's kind of a rite of passage. And in that kind of an environment, you've got a military that is not heterogeneous rather than homogeneous. That has a fair amount of variety in it, which I would think would push policymakers and voters to take very seriously the idea of going to war, as in thinking twice about it, rather than this glib George W. Bush, oh yeah, we'll just send some guys over there kind of thing. Thoughts?
Exactly. And George W. Bush, by the way, did avoid the military during the Vietnam War.
Oh, he went AWOL.
Joined the National Guard. But, I think the system you just explained there, Tom, would have a great deal of merit because it's more egalitarian. It would affect all classes in America equally and perhaps contribute to the development of our country and the prevention of foreign wars of intervention that are unnecessary, like Vietnam or the more recent wars of George W. Bush. Right. So, I think there is some merit to that system.
What was the situation or what was your experience of? Let me start over again. In this, I was in SDS in the '60s as well, and there were really two mass movements going on in the '60s. There was the anti-war movement, which was largely white, and there was the civil rights movement, which was largely black. And although there were a lot of people who crossed over both, and at least at Michigan State, where I was, it was virtually an entirely white campus, and there was not a lot of civil rights activity going on. There was some, and SDS was all in favor of it. I mean, in fact, the Port Huron Statement originally was about social justice. It was not about the Vietnam War, and thus the founding of SDS. But your thoughts on the relationship between the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement then and now?
Well, I think there should be a link. When I was in the SDS at Kent State, we talked a lot about racism. We talked about equality for men and women. We talked about exploitation, and we certainly did talk about the war. Civil rights was very important to our generation. I think it still is, obviously, if you look at the news today about Baltimore and elsewhere. I think it's very important for people to be aware that sometimes these problems of race and war and militarism, they're all interconnected because of the people that make the decisions in this country. Generally, they're very wealthy people. They have an extraordinary amount of influence on our political system. So I think people have to be aware and fight on all fronts.
And 9 times out of 10, whether we're talking about issues of race or war or peace or policing or, fill in the blank, it ultimately comes down to economics, the control of economics and to a large extent, both classism and racism running the economic system. In the minute we have left, Alan, your thoughts on that?
I think I agree with that, no doubt about it. And that's all the more reason why we need a more powerful movement from the grassroots up in this country. That's the only way that politicians or corporate leaders will pay any attention if the power of the people is expressed. And I think that was the lesson of our generation in the 60s, and that's still a very valid lesson today. People have to become awakened. They have to join together and raise their voices to promote positive change.
Yeah, it's electing politicians ain't enough. Nothing happens till people organize. It's mass movements.
That's very true. At Kent State, we learned that lesson. Tonight, I want to mention that PBS, National Television, tonight is having a 1-hour documentary film about Kent State, Vietnam, and the National Student Strike of 1970. Check your local listings at PBS tonight around 8 o'clock.
That should be fascinating. Alan Canfora, his website, AlanCanfora.com, AlanCanfora.com, May4.org, and, of course, lessonsofvietnam.com, the conference this weekend where I'll be moderating a panel that Alan's going to be on here in Washington, D.C. at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church. Alan, thank you.
Thank you. See you this weekend.
Yep.